You ready to explore some more fascinating history with me today?
Always excited to dig into these sources. Let's see what we've got.
Today we're looking at the history of Christians persecuted for their beliefs.
Yeah, we're going all the way back to biblical times and then through to some lesser-known groups from the 1300s to the 1900s.
Definitely going to be a journey across time and continents to understand better how faith and power and societal change all kind of collided.
Yeah, it's not just about names and dates. We want to understand the motivations behind these persecutions. You know, what drove people to do this?
Exactly. And we're going to start with the familiar stories from the Bible to set the stage.
Yeah.
You know, those early examples of persecution show patterns that keep repeating throughout history.
For sure. And it's amazing to see all the different ways persecution happened, even in those early stories. You know, some people like Moses were persecuted for their actions, defying the Egyptian authorities.
Right? Makes sense. That was a big no-no. And then you have others like Daniel, whose unwavering faith landed him in that lion's den.
Wow, talk about standing up for your beliefs. I mean, refusing to bow to anyone but his God, that's serious conviction.
And then there's the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those guys who wouldn't bow to that golden statue. Most people know they survived the fiery furnace.
That's the big takeaway, right? Like they came out totally unscathed.
Exactly. But I think what often gets overlooked is that the king's decree was as much about political dominance as it was about religion.
Oh, definitely. It was all about control, showing everyone who was in charge, both religiously and politically.
It highlights just how intertwined those two forces are. You know, religion and politics, they always seem to get mixed up together in stories of persecution.
Over and over again. We'll see that play out for centuries.
All right, so let's fast forward now to between the years 1300 and 1900, a period packed with stories of persecution.
Definitely. And we've got some juicy ones to dive into.
Like the Knights Templar. Their story starts on Friday, October 13th, 1307. Imagine how memorable that date would be.
Oh, I bet they never forgot that Friday the 13th. Talk about bad luck.
But it's more than just a spooky date, right? They were this powerful group. They started humbly protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land, but they gained so much wealth and power.
That's right. They became a major force, which ultimately made them a target for King Philip V of France. He wanted to eliminate them, seize their assets, and he used accusations of heresy and blasphemy to do it.
So it was like a power grab masked as religious zeal?
Exactly. He knew how to manipulate religious feelings for his own political gain. And this pattern will show up again and again in history, sadly.
It's crazy how often that happens. Now let's talk about John Huss. He was a key figure. He was a forerunner to the Reformation, right?
Absolutely. What's fascinating about Huss is his belief in having the Bible in the common language.
So everyone could understand it.
That's right. Radical idea for the time. And it paved the way for reformers like Martin Luther, but it also got him into trouble.
Condemned for heresy and executed.
Tragic ending, especially because he was promised safe passage.
Another broken promise for political gain. It's a recurring theme, unfortunately. But speaking of challenging the status quo, we have to talk about Martin Luther. Everyone knows about his 95 Theses.
Right, but there's so much more to his story. His defiance wasn't just theological, it was a direct challenge to the church's authority.
Both spiritual and political.
And challenging power like that came with consequences.
He was declared an outlaw,
facing possible arrest, even death.
But luckily, certain German princes who supported his ideas protected him.
It shows how much those political alliances mattered back then.
They could really make or break you.
Yeah.
So fascinating to think how differently things might have gone if Luther hadn't found those allies.
Absolutely. Now we also have the Moravians in our sources. I always find their stories so inspiring.
They follow the teachings of John Huss, don't they?
Yes. They originated from Huss's followers in Bohemia and Moravia. What's remarkable is their resilience.
They faced persecution but didn't just survive.
No, they thrived. They spread their faith all over the globe, even established missions as far as the Americas.
It's like they were scattered like seeds, but their faith just kept growing.
Powerful image. And it shows how persecution sometimes backfires. Instead of wiping out a belief system, it can actually spread it.
Unintended consequences, for sure. Now let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Our sources say that between 1300 and 1900, persecution of Christians by governments was a global phenomenon.
It wasn't just limited to Europe, this happened all over the world.
It's a sobering thought. Really makes you think about the struggles for religious freedom and how faith and power have been at odds for centuries.
Yeah, it's a global story, a complex tapestry woven through history.
Wow, a global story. So where do we even begin to unpack all of this?
We could start with the Huguenots in France. They faced some serious pressure during those French wars of religion.
The Huguenots. Okay.
Yeah, they were actually granted some religious freedom at first.
Really?
Yeah, under the Edict of Nantes. But then Louis XIV revoked it.
Oh, wow. So much for freedom.
Yeah, it shows how fragile tolerance can be, especially when politics get involved.
It makes you wonder if any of those agreements really last.
Right, exactly. And our sources also mentioned the Anabaptists. They popped up during the Reformation.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about them. They were seen as pretty radical, weren't they?
Yeah, even by other Protestants, their beliefs really shook things up. They rejected infant baptism, embraced pacifism, and they challenged the whole system.
Both Catholics and Protestants saw them as a threat, huh?
Absolutely. But what's really striking is their commitment to nonviolence.
Even when they were being persecuted.
Yeah. It makes you think, what kind of inner strength does that take to hold on to those convictions when everything's falling apart around you?
It's almost like their faith was unbreakable, unwavering.
Exactly. And it speaks to the power of a deep-seated belief system, putting peace above everything else.
It's hard to imagine having that level of commitment in such a turbulent time. Now, we've already talked about political maneuvering in these stories of persecution, but our sources highlight even more examples.
Oh, for sure. Take the persecution of Eastern Catholics, for instance.
Eastern Catholics.
Yeah, they were Christians living in places like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Russian Empire. They recognized the Pope in Rome, unlike Orthodox Christians.
So basically they picked the wrong side.
In a way, yeah. And they became targets of repression. Those political leaders wanted to control everything, including religious allegiance.
Wow. So your choice of which branch of Christianity you followed could have serious consequences.
Absolutely. Religion was a tool for political control. And that theme of rejecting the dominant religious practices pops up again and again.
They were the Quakers, right?
Yes, the Quakers, they believed in equality pacifism, and they thought you could have a direct relationship with God without needing a priest.
Which put them at odds with the established church.
Definitely. They refused to swear oaths or fight in wars, too.
Yeah, that probably didn't make them popular.
It alienated them from the authorities, so they were persecuted not just for what they believed, but how they lived.
Their actions spoke louder than words in a way.
Exactly. And this theme of nonconformity really gets under the skin of those in power. We see it with the dissenters and nonconformists in England, too.
Those were Baptists, Methodists, Congregationalists, right?
You got it. They refused to conform to the Church of England.
And faced the consequences.
Penalties, discrimination, you name it. Their insistence on worshiping outside the established structure was a direct challenge to the Church's authority.
Which was tied to the state's authority.
Right. It all goes back to power in the end. Now, shifting gears a bit, our sources also talk about some pretty intense persecution in Japan.
Japan?
That's interesting. Yeah, in the 16th century, Christianity began spreading in Japan. Japanese rulers saw Christianity as a threat. They felt their power was under threat from it. In the 1630s, the Shimabara Rebellion erupted. Christian peasants played a big role in this rebellion. The shogunate responded with force. Christianity was outlawed across Japan. Japanese Christians faced harsh persecution. Many Christians were forced to renounce their faith. The persecution reminded people of Anabaptists. Fear often drives people to extremity. Similar patterns appeared under Ottoman rule. Orthodox Christians there faced heavy taxation. They endured violence and massacres. Conflict like the Greek War of Independence worsened it. Our sources also touch on the plight of Orthodox Christians under Ottoman rule.
Oh, right. They had it pretty rough, too.
They faced heavy taxes, violence, massacres. It was especially bad during times of conflict like the Greek War of Independence.
It's like those in power always need someone to blame.
Right. Religious minorities often become scapegoats. And speaking of internal conflicts, our notes mention the Old Believers in Russia.
Old Believers.
They were actually persecuted by their own Orthodox Church.
Wow. Talk about a family feud.
They refused to accept some reforms in the mid-17th century.
Liturgical reform.
Exactly. And that got them labeled as heretics. They faced persecution from both the church and the czar.
It's a reminder that persecution can come from anywhere, even from within your own faith.
It's not always about different religions clashing. Sometimes it's about disagreements within the same tradition.
Divisions can run deep. Before we wrap up this part, I want to touch on something else mentioned in our sources. Christian missionaries in China.
Yes. The 19th century was a tumultuous time for China.
Lots of change and upheaval.
And those Christian missionaries were seen as symbols of the West.
Which made them target.
Exactly. They faced resentment, hostility. And it all culminated in the Boxer Rebellion,
A violent uprising.
aimed at kicking out foreigners and wiping out Chinese Christians.
A terrifying example of how religious tensions can get mixed up with nationalism and anti-foreign sentiment.
It's a reminder that these dynamics are complex. It's not just about religion, it's about politics, culture, economics. Everything's intertwined.
Wow, it's a lot to take in. Centuries of persecution all over the world. It's really heavy stuff. As we wrap up this deep dive, I keep wondering what allowed these groups to not only survive, but to actually thrive in the face of all this.
It's the million-dollar question, right? It's something that's fascinated people for ages. I think a big part of it was their unwavering faith. They believed in something so strongly that they were willing to endure anything for it.
Even death.
Even death. They saw a bigger picture, something beyond themselves. It's hard for us to grasp that level of conviction today.
It really is. It's almost unimaginable. But it wasn't just about individual strength, was it? They had those communities too.
Absolutely. The power of community can't be overstated. It gave them a sense of belonging, purpose, support. They weren't alone in their struggles.
This is like their shared hardship actually brought them closer.
Exactly. Facing that external pressure together forged these incredibly strong bonds. And we also can't forget the role of storytelling.
Passing those stories down.
Yes. Those accounts of persecution weren't just history, they were inspiration. They reminded people of their ancestors' resilience and the importance of standing firm in their faith.
So the stories weren't just about the past, they were about the present and the future.
Exactly, they kept that spirit alive. So as we finish up this exploration of persecution, what can we learn from all of this? How can we apply these lessons to our own lives?
Because even though we might not face the same kind of persecution today, the underlying issues are still there, right?
Right.
Intolerance, discrimination, abuse of power.
Absolutely, those things haven't gone away. We have to be vigilant. We have to learn from history so we can recognize the warning signs and speak out against injustice.
And that doesn't always mean grand gestures of defiance, does it? It can be about the little things too.
It's about how we treat each other every single day, showing respect and dignity to everyone. No matter what they believe or where they come from, we need to create a world where everyone feels safe, valued, heard.
What a powerful message. This deep dive has really been eye-opening, It's been tough to hear about all this suffering, but it's also been inspiring. It reminds us of the power of faith, the importance of community, the constant struggle for religious freedom and tolerance.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can find a word to not just survive, but to flourish.
And that's a message we should all carry with us as we go about our lives. Let's remember to show compassion, empathy, and to fight for justice for everyone. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. We hope it's made you think and inspired you to keep learning.
And to keep questioning. And to keep searching for a better world.